Today, we are taking on a giant of modern thought, but we are looking at the version of him you almost certainly have never encountered.
Yeah, our mission today is, well, it's a major intellectual repositioning, really. We are cracking open the canon of Karl Marx and shifting him out of the tight, sort of Eurocentric philosophical sphere he's often put into. We're tracing his profound intellectual journey into global anti-colonial revolutionary theory. This isn't just about reading Capital, it's about reading his life's work through the lens of global struggle.
That's right. When most people think of Marx, they conjure up images of a bearded philosopher writing dense, very European critiques in the British Museum. They think of the Communist Manifesto or the standard volumes of Capital. But we are looking at Marx, the global intellectual, the marginalized figure, living as an immigrant among us, as the philosopher Jacques Derrida once described him, a glorious, sacred, accursed but still clandestine immigrant supported by his friends and by the necessity of reporting on global crises.
Absolutely. He was a political refugee in Victorian London, genuinely marginalized, often living in poverty, and critically, his primary income source for many years was acting as the chief European correspondent for the New York Tribune, the largest circulation newspaper in the world at the time.
Right, the Tribune. That's key.
It really is. This position, writing journalism just to pay the bills, forced him daily to grapple with the real messy reality of global politics, the slave trade, empire, and it profoundly altered his theoretical trajectory away from the abstract theories developed purely in libraries. It pushed him.
And the really revelatory part of this deep dive, the part that addresses the historical gaps in how he's understood, especially by those interested in decolonial thought, is what most mainstream scholars, and certainly the general public, have long ignored. His clandestine, largely unpublished writings, particularly from his final years.
These are not mere footnotes, not at all. We're talking about extensive, meticulous excerpt notebooks from his last 4 years of life, roughly 1879 to 1882, dedicated almost entirely to non-Western and pre-capitalist societies. This research was exhaustive.
And when you say extensive, you mean globally significant.
Oh, absolutely. The full corpus of his collected writings, the Marx Engels Gesam Toskab or Mega 2, this huge scholarly project, will comprise 32 planned volumes dedicated just to these late excerpt notebooks.
32 volumes, just of notes.
Just of these notes, yeah. They cover everything from anthropological works on India, detailed histories of North Africa, Latin America, Indonesia, Russia, the structure of ancient Rome. He was consuming authors like the ethnologist Louis Henry Morgan, the historian Maxim Kovalevsky. Others focused on communal property structures outside of Western Europe. It is here, in these recently accessed texts, that we gain this unique ability to hear Marx think, to see him moving away from broad, implicitly Eurocentric assumptions that characterized some of his earlier work.
Okay, so this vast, neglected material supports a single, overarching argument about Marx's intellectual life. What is that core claim, then?
The central claim is that Marx underwent a profound evolution of thought. A really significant one. He moved from an implicitly unilinear perspective. That's the common 19th century idea that all societies must pass through the same rigid stages, like feudalism, capitalism, etc. An idea which often justified colonialism as a painful but necessary modernizing force.
Right, the idea that everyone had to follow England's path, basically.
Exactly. He moved from that to becoming a profound, multilinear, non-determinist thinker.
Okay, so multilinear. If unilinear meant everyone follows one track, what does multilinear imply?
It implies a kind of intellectual liberation, really. Multilinearism means he recognized that there could be a variety of possible pathways toward development and, crucially, toward revolution for societies outside of Western Europe. It meant that non-Western societies didn't have to wait for the European industrial working class to lead the way. Their own indigenous structures.
Like communal property.
Exactly, like communal property forms or national liberation movements, could serve as legitimate starting points for socialism. This allowed them to potentially skip the devastating, fateful vicissitudes of the capitalist stage altogether.
That is a radical shift, especially considering the time he was writing. And we see this evolution manifesting in two major themes in his mature work. Is that right?
Precisely. Two main areas. First, the question of the future development and revolutionary potential of non-Western societies, specifically Russia, India, China, Algeria, Indonesia. He wanted to understand how they could generate change internally. Second, and this is crucial, the centrality of oppressed nationalities and ethnic groups like the Poles, the Irish, Black people in the U.S., to the democratic and labor movements within the core capitalist countries. These groups weren't side notes in the global struggle. Marx came to see they were the essential strategic levers for global change.
Okay, let's dig into that evolution. To understand the shift, we have to start where Marx started, the mid-1850s, specifically with those, well, infamous 1853 Tribune articles on India. We see him wrestling with European philosophical tradition here.
Yeah, the intellectual framework at this time was very heavily influenced by Hegel's philosophy of history. And that lens was problematic because Hegel had characterized India as a stationary and fixed society, sort of paralyzed by the caste system and Brahmin domination, suffering from internal despotism and mass passivity.
The idea of peoples without history.
Exactly. For Hegel, there was no sense of personal independence or drive for historical dynamism compared to the evolving West.
And initially, Marx kind of echoed this philosophical framework, which is where much of the later criticism of his supposed Eurocentrism comes from. He conceded that Britain, despite its brutality, had broken down the entire framework of Indian society, driven by English steam and English free trade. He even called this destructive colonial intrusion the only social revolution ever heard of in Asia. Pretty strong words.
They are. And it's important to understand why he framed it that way initially. He attributed India's perceived lack of dynamism, what he called its stagnatory and vegetative life, to two specific economic foundations of what he termed Oriental despotism.
Which were?
Okay, first he argued there was a necessity for centralized governmental interference for vast-scale artificial irrigation. Maintaining canals, public works are vital for agriculture in arid regions. He saw this as different from the voluntary association he saw forming in the West. The state, therefore, became indispensable and despotic because it controlled the material basis of life.
Makes sense. And the second?
Second, and perhaps more critically, were the economically self-sufficient village communities. He argued these villages, being kind of closed off and perfectly capable of reproducing themselves year after year without much external connection, were the solid foundation of Oriental despotism.
So for early Marx, the village community, which later becomes a potential revolutionary structure in his eyes, was initially seen as the cause of stagnation.
Exactly. For the Marx of 1853, stagnation was inherently negative. It suggested a failure of human history, a denial of man's creative ability to transform his own conditions. He argued the British canon brutally was necessary to break that spell.
Right. This brings us directly to the strongest critique of his early Eurocentrism, famously leveled by Edward Said. Said argued that Marx's initial perspective showed that a romantic Orientalist vision wins out. He pointed specifically to Marx's use of a stanza from Goethe in The British Rule in India to suggest a justification of suffering.
Ah, yes, that Goethe stanza. It's notorious. It speaks of the tortures of tyranny or suffering that bring, in the end, greater pleasure. The implication being that the suffering of colonial subjugation was somehow justified because it brought the eventual progress of modernity.
If you read that line in isolation, as Said did, well, it looks pretty bad, like a crude justification for colonial violence for the sake of forced modernization.
It does. But the sources show a crucial, vital rebuttal to that reading. It really demands a closer look at the context.
Go on.
Well, when we examine Marx's full body of work, we see he repeatedly cited that exact same Goethe stanza in other writings,
Right.
writings that had absolutely nothing to do with India.
Such as?
For instance, he used it to characterize the brutal, dehumanizing mindset of the capitalist who was working English factory workers and coal miners to death. He used it to describe the callous disregard for human life inherent in the pursuit of profit, in a purely European context.
So, this isn't Marx justifying colonial violence himself. This is Marx strategically employing a piece of high German poetry to describe the mindset of the colonizer, using the language of high culture against them.
That's the key nuance that has to be stressed, I think. When Marx quoted that line in the India article, it seems much more likely he was characterizing the British colonialist perspective. That cold, self-justifying way the colonizer rationalizes their violence and destruction by pointing towards some abstract future benefit, rather than offering his own ethical justification for the pain.
Using it as a critical literary device, almost sarcastically.
Perhaps. Or at least using it to expose the ideology underpinning the violence, not endorse the violence itself.
And even in those 1853 writings, before the massive shift we're talking about, there were already cracks appearing in the unilinear framework. Some early signs of a profound anti-colonial perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Despite his reliance on that Hegelian framework, Marx couldn't help but critique the realities of British rule on the ground. He referred to the inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization. He noted that the British completely neglected the essential public works function of Asian governments that had regulated water and agriculture for millennia, resulting in catastrophic agricultural deterioration and mass pauperization.
So he was pointing out that even if colonialism was destructive, it wasn't even achieving the modernizing job it claimed to be doing. It was just destructive.
Right, it was failing even on its own terms, while causing immense suffering.
And the suffering wasn't just localized to India. He saw connections.
Far from it. This neglect and destruction had global interconnected consequences. He famously saw cholera epidemics spreading abroad from India as India's revenge upon the Western world, calling it a striking and severe example of the solidarity of human woes and wrongs.
Wow, the solidarity of human woes and wrongs. That shows an early, undeniable recognition of global interconnectedness through shared suffering. Maybe what we might call today the solidarity of the oppressed.
Exactly. And most importantly, even back in 1853, he already predicted a twin challenge to British capitalism: the rise of the British working classes, the internal crisis, and the rise of an Indian national liberation movement, the external crisis, capable of throwing off the English yoke altogether.
So even then, he saw resistance coming from both the core and the periphery simultaneously, not just waiting for Europe.
Precisely. The seeds of the later multilinear view were already there, even if overshadowed by the Hegelian framework at the time.
Okay, so that early ambivalence, the idea that colonialism was maybe necessary but definitely terrible, quickly evaporated as global events heated up in the mid-1850s. The sources show Marx transitioning from a, let's say, conflicted journalist to an unequivocal supporter of anti-colonial resistance.
Yes, the global crises of the Second Opium War in China and the Sepoy Uprising in India between 1857 and 1858 really sharpened his views dramatically. Regarding China, Marx basically stopped trying to find any justification for European action. He strongly refuted those denouncing the Chinese, stating unequivocally, the Chinese have at least 99 injuries to complain of to one on the part of the English. Pretty clear stance there.
He didn't just critique the policy, he focused on the sheer brutality of the soldiers on the ground, didn't he?
Absolutely. He implicitly took back some of his earlier, more detached views on the First Opium War by detailing the European atrocities committed by British soldiery for mere fun of it, citing reports of violations of women and roastings of whole villages. For Marx, the veneer of the civilizing mission had completely broken down. What was left was just barbarism and plunder, pure and simple.
And then the Sepoy Uprising in India in 57-58, that was truly a pivotal moment for him. The rebellion itself was messy, complex, involving multiple interests and groups, but Marx immediately recognized immense revolutionary potential in it.
He did. He was following the uprising meticulously in the Tribune, and he declared in a letter to Engels, this is famous, India is now our best ally.
Our best ally. That's a huge statement, a statement of revolutionary strategy, placing the colonized subject right at the forefront of the global struggle against British capital.
Absolutely. It's a strategic reorientation. And what was his key strategic observation about the uprising?
Tell us.
He observed this powerful destructive irony in colonial administration. British policy was based on divide and rule, playing off different castes, ethnic groups, religious identities to maintain control.
Right.
Yet, by forming a massive centralized colonial army composed of Indians from various backgrounds, they inadvertently manufactured a unified organizational structure. This colonial army of sepoys was precisely the body that generated a unified Indian national consciousness and organization.
So the very instrument of colonial control became the first general center of resistance which the Indian people was ever possessed of. It was completely self-defeating for the empire.
Exactly. It demonstrates Marx identifying the colonized population not as passive victims of historical forces, not the stagnant masses of 1853, but as active historical agents capable of organized, unified resistance against global capital. This shift is absolutely crucial for decolonial readings of Marx.
And this intense engagement with global struggles, particularly the U.S. Civil War, which broke out just a few years later, 1861-1865, also fundamentally shaped his core economic theory, even the structure of capital volume on itself.
Yes, profoundly. He saw the war against chattel slavery as arguably the most important international class struggle of his time. Marx asserted plainly that the veiled slavery of the wage laborers in Europe needed the unqualified slavery of the New World as its pedestal.
That's a powerful claim. The wealth extraction was foundational.
It means he viewed the profit generated by enslaved labor in the American South as a crucial underpinning, a material necessity for the stability and expansion of global industrial capitalism, both in the North and back in Europe. The cotton industry literally rested on the backs of enslaved workers.
And this led him to make one of his most powerful assertions regarding the essentiality of racial solidarity in the struggle for class liberation.
Yes, the famous quote, "Labor in a white skin cannot emancipate itself where it is branded in a black skin."
That quote is just stunning in its clarity. It makes the struggle against racial oppression a non-negotiable prerequisite for working class liberation everywhere, especially in places like Britain and the US, where those dynamics were so present.
It demands that the working class address the internal divisions of race and empire before seeking class unity. It's not an afterthought. And this connection wasn't merely rhetorical either. The Marxist humanist Raya Dunayevskaya made a powerful argument that the U.S. Civil War and the dedicated support for the Union by British workers — remember, they endured the cotton famine rather than supported the Confederacy — were so crucial that they actually inspired Marx to add the key chapter on the working day to Capital Volume 1.
Wait, hold on. You're saying that the political struggle against American slavery directly inspired a key theoretical chapter about European factory workers. How does that theoretical link function? That's fascinating.
It's all about agency and resistance. See, the initial drafts of Capital were apparently much more abstract, focusing more on the purely objective laws of economics. The chapter on the working day, however, is different. It chronicles the active struggle and political resistance of the working class against the limitless exploitation of capital, the fight for the 10-hour day, factory acts, and so on.
So it's about struggle, not just economic laws.
Exactly. Dunayevskaya argued that the heroism and agency shown by the black slaves fighting for freedom, combined with the solidarity shown by the white British textile workers who suffered for that cause, fundamentally affirmed Marx's belief that the working class was an active historical subject capable of political struggle, not merely a passive economic category. This resistance, this agency, was then incorporated directly into the theoretical core of his masterpiece. It grounded the theory in actual human struggle.
That makes the movement away from pure abstraction toward recognizing the concrete struggle of the oppressed, a central feature of capital's own development. Amazing.
Absolutely. The actual resistance of black slaves and white abolitionist workers fundamentally altered the theory, giving the working class a theoretical voice within the text that moved beyond the more deterministic economic framework of some earlier drafts.
Okay, now let's move across the Irish Sea. We see a parallel and perhaps even more strategically complex evolution in his thinking about nationalism and class in the 1860s, specifically regarding Ireland.
Ireland. Yes. This is where Marx truly codified his strategy regarding a subjugated nation within a core capitalist power. And his view changed drastically within the First International. He moved from considering Irish separation impossible or maybe even counterproductive to deeming it inevitable and strategically necessary by 1867, a complete turnaround.
Why? Why did Ireland, an internal colony, suddenly become the most critical strategic point for the English Revolution in his view?
He identified two critical, intertwined strategic failures within Britain that Ireland, he thought, could address. First, Ireland was the bulwark of English landlordism. The aristocracy that still held enormous power in England drew its strength, its wealth, and its moral authority largely from the brutal expropriation of Irish tenants.
So the power structure in England depended on exploitation in Ireland.
Heavily. Overthrowing landlordism in Ireland, where the struggle was simultaneously economic against evictions, land seizures, and intensely national, because the landlords were the mortally hated oppressors of the nationality, was, he argued, strategically simpler than tackling the deeply entrenched aristocratic class structure in Britain itself.
So the colonial periphery became the weakest link, the most vulnerable point in the capitalist aristocratic system's armor. It was easier to shatter the entire structure by focusing on the Irish question.
Precisely. It was the strategic entry point. Now, the second point addressed the internal failure, the division of the British working class. Marx realized the English bourgeoisie maintained its power largely by deliberately splitting the English proletariat into two hostile camps, English workers and Irish workers.
How was this division maintained? What were the mechanics of it?
Well, through systemic discrimination, through stoked fear, and direct economic competition. The English worker, Marx observed, often hated the Irish worker as a desperate competitor who drove down wages. And this antagonism was further fueled by national and religious antipathies, actively promoted by the ruling class.
And he drew a powerful comparison here, didn't he?
He did. He explicitly compared this toxic internal antagonism, this national and ethnic hatred used to divide the workers in Britain, to how the poor whites of the southern states of North America viewed black slaves.
Wow. That comparison is deeply insightful and resonates strongly even today with analyses of how racial and ethnic divisions are used to blunt class power. He's equating the internal colonial tensions in Britain directly to the deep institutionalized racial and economic divide in the American South.
The comparison is stunning because it elevates the national question in Ireland and the race question in America to the same strategic level. He saw both as essential mechanisms by which the ruling class maintains control over the entire proletariat, white and black, English and Irish. So the strategic conclusion for the First International became crystal clear. The emancipation of Ireland was not just a matter of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of the English working class's own social emancipation.
Without Irish freedom, the English working class could never unite, never overthrow its own masters. It was a prerequisite.
That was his powerful and controversial argument.
This multilinear perspective, this recognition that history does not follow a single predetermined West European path, really culminated in Marx's late period, didn't it? Where he was so convinced of this shift that he physically edited his most significant theoretical text, Capital, to reflect the change.
Yes, this is perhaps the most concrete proof of his evolution. It's not just in letters or notebooks. When Marx prepared the French edition of Capital Volume 1 between 1872 and 75, which was the last edition he personally oversaw and the most comprehensive, he made a subtle but frankly earth-shattering amendment to the chapter on primitive accumulation.
Okay, what did he do?
He added specific passages that expressly limited the scope of the analysis of primitive accumulation to Western Europe.
Right, I see. Why does this one detail limiting the analysis geographically matter so much to the entire theory? It sounds technical, but you're saying it's huge.
It's huge because primitive accumulation, that violent, brutal process of expropriation that created the conditions for capitalism, enclosures, colonialism, etc., was often read by his followers and his critics as a universal, necessary blueprint. Critics, especially the Russian populace, were deeply worried about this. They feared that Marx's analysis meant Russia had to suffer through the same violent, devastating enclosure movements and industrial exploitation that England went through before it could even think about achieving socialism.
So by limiting the classic form of expropriation specifically to England and continental Europe, Marx was trying to theoretically shield non-Western societies from that historical necessity.
That's exactly it. He was essentially saying, look, the path of Western Europe, involving mass rural displacement, the creation of a vast urban proletariat, imperial plunder, all of that, that is not the required global blueprint. It happened here, like this, but it doesn't have to happen everywhere in the same way.
He was rejecting the determinism that his own earlier work seemed to imply, or at least how it was being interpreted. He was explicitly affirming a multilinear, non-deterministic view. Other paths were possible, perhaps based on existing indigenous social structures.
Precisely. And this search for alternative paths led him directly to his late-life research in those 1879-82 notebooks we mentioned, specifically his intense focus on indigenous communal property. He was clearly looking for persistent sites of resistance that existed outside of the classic European factory floor.
His research focus was incredible then. What was he reading?
Oh, all sorts. He extensively studied communal property forms in colonized societies. He devoured authors like Maxim Kovalevsky on Algeria, focusing particularly on how French colonial policy was deliberately designed to destroy the traditional douar, the communal landholding village structure there.
And what was the motivation of the French regime, according to Marx's notes, to destroy these communal property structures in North Africa?
Well, Marx noted what the French colonizers themselves were actually saying. The French legislators, whom Marx refers to by the derisive nickname rurals, because they were these conservative, monarchist, landowning reactionaries who dominated the National Assembly after the fall of the Second Empire, they saw indigenous communal property as a profound political threat.
A threat? How so?
They consciously drew a connection between the communal land tenure systems in Algeria and the contemporary socialist movement back in Europe.
That is a fascinating insight. The French colonialists saw traditional North African land tenure as essentially socialist, and therefore a political enemy.
Exactly. Both traditional communalism and modern socialism were seen as existential obstacles to consolidating bourgeois private property and creating a compliant, alienated labor force, whether that was in Paris or in Algiers. Marx, who was clearly angered by this calculated colonial dispossession, lashed out in his notes at the Assembly of Rurals for legislating the stealing the land of the Arabs.
And he didn't stop there. He connected the colonial violence directly back to the European class struggle, didn't he?
Yes, this is key. Marx explicitly connected the act of colonial dispossession in Algeria to the rurals' own brutal repression of the Paris Commune, the workers' government, just a few years earlier in 1871. He saw the same reactionary class interest, the same political enemy, orchestrating violence against both the modern communal forms, the Parisian workers, and the historical communal forms, the Arab landholders in Algeria.
That connection is vital for understanding his late thought. The idea that the global forces of reaction were unified against all forms of collective non-capitalist life, whether ancient or modern. And this research demonstrated to Marx that these communal forms were not simply unchanging remnants, relics of the past, as he might have implied back in 1853.
Exactly. They were persistent sites of social antagonism and potential active resistance against capital and empire. They weren't just passive.
And this research culminated in his final, really dramatic theoretical evolution regarding the Russian rural commune, the Obshchina. This structure presented the ultimate challenge to the entire unilinear historical model he started with.
Absolutely. The Obshchina became the test case.
And it was the Russian populace, people like Verozasilik, who forced the issue, right? They posed a direct existential question to Marx about Russia's path forward.
They did. They wrote to him directly. They asked Marx explicitly if Russia must first pass through capitalism with all its fateful vicissitudes and immense suffering to eventually reach socialism. This was a critical, burning question for them at the time, as Russia was just beginning its chaotic, top-down process of industrialization.
A huge question for revolutionaries there. And what was his final non-deterministic answer, expressed in his drafts of the letter to Zasilik and also in the preface to the 1882 Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto?
He concluded, and this was radical, that the rural commune, Obshchina, with its tradition of common land ownership and periodic repartition of land, could indeed be the point of departure for a communist development.
The point of departure, that's huge.
It was the ultimate endorsement of a non-capitalist path towards socialism based on an indigenous, non-Western European communal structure. He was fundamentally validating the possibility of bypassing the capitalist stage entirely under certain conditions.
But he placed a critical material proviso on this possibility. It wasn't automatic. It couldn't happen in isolation, right?
That's the key strategic point. He wasn't being utopian. Marx knew the Obshchina was already decaying under pressure from the Tsarist state and emerging market forces. He clarified that this non-capitalist path was only possible if the Russian Revolution was able to link up with a working-class revolution in the industrially developed West.
Ah, the link up. Why was that necessary?
The West would provide the necessary technological material aid, the industrial knowledge, the machines, the infrastructure, but crucially, without imposing capitalist exploitation. The idea was socialist solidarity, not capitalist development aid.
So the Revolutionary Alliance was essential. The communal periphery, like Russia with its indigenous structures, providing the non-capitalist starting point, and the developed core, Western Europe, providing the material means for modernization on a non-exploitative basis.
Exactly. This alliance was the essential dynamic for a truly global revolution in his late thought. It showed Russia was capable, potentially, of forming the vanguard of revolutionary action in Europe, not just following behind. It really synthesized his earlier strategic thinking on Ireland and India with his late research on communal property, forming a truly multilinear global theory of revolution.
So if we synthesize this entire intellectual journey from the, let's say, implicitly Eurocentric journalist of 1853 to the multilinear, globally engaged theorist of the 1880s, what remains is a far more useful and complex figure for understanding global conflict today, especially for those interested in anti-colonial and decolonial perspectives.
Absolutely. The sheer depth and breadth of his late-life research shows his profound shift. His critique of capital, in the end, was broad enough to encompass the huge varieties of human social and historical development. He came to understand that viewing the world through a single European lens was a theoretical failure. His concept of totality ultimately offered immense scope for particularity and difference, recognizing indigenous forms of resistance and non-Western social structures as potential revolutionary levers.
And his mature social theory, particularly after the 1860s, concentrated increasingly on the essential intersectionality, though he didn't use that word, of course, of class with ethnicity, race, and nationalism. He identified the mechanisms by which racism and national oppression function, not as mere cultural deviations or unfortunate political mistakes, but as tools absolutely essential to the maintenance of capitalist power structures.
Yes, whether that meant splitting English and Irish workers in Britain or creating the pedestal of chattel slavery in the U.S. for European industrial capitalism to stand on, these weren't side issues, they were structural pillars.
This is why these neglected writings, the journalism, the notebooks, the letters, are so vital for decolonial and indigenous thought today, isn't it? Marx argued that it wasn't enough for the European working class to address only internal class exploitation within their own countries.
Right. They were strategically required, for their own sake, to champion the struggles of oppressed nations and races, like Ireland, Poland, Black Americans, as a precondition for their own liberation. The failure to do so, as he saw with the poor whites in the American South clinging to racial privilege, or the English workers' contempt for the Irish, meant sacrificing their own potential freedom in exchange for maintaining a fleeting, illusory sense of racial or national superiority, which ultimately served only the ruling class.
So the ultimate takeaway seems to be that Marx's late multilinear dialectic, where revolution doesn't necessarily have a single origin point in the advanced West, but can be triggered from the periphery, from the sites of combined oppression, offers a completely unexpected and highly relevant strategic framework for today. It demands we look beyond just the factory floor for the sources of revolutionary energy and transformation.
Indeed, it forces us to acknowledge that the most powerful unified resistance often arises precisely where economic exploitation is compounded by national, ethnic, or racial oppression. These intersections are where the contradictions are sharpest. So the final provocative thought we want to leave you with is this. If Marx concluded, after decades of study, that an Irish national revolution was the necessary lever to overthrow capitalism in Britain, or that a Russian communal revolution linked to the West could be the point of departure for Europe-wide communism, how might we apply that late multilinear focus today? How can it help us theorize and support the struggles of indigenous and decolonial movements around the world? Movements facing a globalized capitalism that still profoundly relies on land dispossession, resource extraction, and systemic division for its continued existence. That seems like a crucial question his late work poses for us now.